Hi, my name is Maria Martinez, and I am going to give you a very brief explanation about project-based learning. And so the first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and give you a quick disclaimer. All the information that you're going to see on here actually comes from a previous assignment, a wiki that was designed by myself and my partner, Donna Cousins. So if you're interested in a list of APA references, you can actually go to the website that is listed here to access that. So basically, let's go ahead and start with what is project-based learning. And so what we're going to do is just kind of talk about what some of the different parts of project-based learning are, and then we're going to actually break this up into the individual parts and talk about them. So project-based learning is comprised of multifaceted projects. It's built around a driving question. Project-based learning contains student choice and voice. It has a real-world focus, has ongoing evaluations, as well as ongoing reflection and revisions. Now, the evaluations and the reflection and revisions are items that are done individually as well as collaboratively. So right off the bat, we can see that project-based learning is not always going to be a group thing. It will be generally, but students will be required to do certain items on their own as well. So let's go ahead and talk about that. The first thing we have are what we call multifaceted projects, projects that are composed of different components. So you may have an ultimate project or product that is due at the end, such as a video. But before we can get to this video, you will have smaller components that will lead up to it. Those smaller components may be things like writings, they may be quizzes, they may be blog entries, they may be screenplays, they may be questions that the student submits to you, but smaller components that will eventually lead up to the larger product. The components may be graded as checks for understanding throughout the project, or they just may be smaller parts that will eventually add up to, again, the larger product as a whole. Now, some of these components may be assigned as individual assignments and then assembled later as part of the whole group. Now, we definitely, sorry about that. We definitely want to make sure that we do have some individual assignments assigned in a project-based learning environment. Yes, we will have groups, but we also want to make sure that the individuals in the groups are also accountable for what's going on. We don't want one individual to be doing the majority of the work while someone is being, of course, lazy. Project-based learning is driven around this idea of the driving question. Now, the driving question is the focus of the assignment or the project. It is what the entire project will be revolved around. And do not let the idea of the question confuse you. Now, it can be a question that we want our students to provide an answer to, and the answer will not be a simple yes or no answer. It may be a problem that we want our students to provide a solution to. And again, it will not be a simple solution. Depending on what the problem is, students may have multiple solutions, and we want to encourage that. Or it may be an in-depth examination of a very large issue. And so again, this is where we get into a large issue that the student will take control of and that they will break down into something smaller and much more controllable and able to accomplish in a set amount of time. Now, the driving question in project-based learning, it differs because in a traditional project, usually students are told what they're going to do, how they're going to research it, what their final product will be. And in this idea of the driving question, we want the driving question to do that. We want it to drive the students into looking at their own research, coming up with their own solutions, and then maybe even how they want to present their final product. As a teacher, you are still very important because what you are is you are the guide. Rather than taking the student's hand and leading them, you are walking next to them and you are giving guidelines to guide them in the right direction. So we want to make sure that the students, of course, are still reaching the ultimate destination, but that does not necessarily mean that they're going to reach it all on the same way. So let's take a look at the difference between a traditional assignment versus project-based learning. Now, these are very similar, but you can see that these are traditional and these have been rewritten as a project-based learning assignment. So let's take a look here. In the traditional assignment, create a PowerPoint that shows how people use algebra in real life? Well, in a project-based learning environment, we might say, how does algebra play a role in the modern world? So right off the bat, we have a question that the students have to think about. Okay, well, how does algebra play a role in the modern world? So this gets them to start thinking about the modern world and, where are all the parts of algebra? Where do they see it? Where do they think it's at? And if, they think it's in the building of a bridge, they need to research that. Does algebra play a role in the building of a bridge? Let me look at that. And then they need to create a visual product which explains and demonstrates their findings. So in this situation, we're just showing how people use algebra in real life. We are basically creating a complex list. And here we are having to, yes, have the students demonstrate how algebra plays a role, but rather than just how people use algebra, they're having to show, okay, how is it used in the modern world? And they're having to explain and demonstrate their findings. So they're going to actually have to explain and demonstrate how is algebra used. The second one in the traditional assignment says, with your group, design a presentation that demonstrates how Americans and other countries view and deal with death. So again, we have group work. We have them designing their own presentation. So we're doing pretty good so far. Demonstrates how Americans and other countries view and deal with death. So we have a little bit more choice here. We're letting them pick their own country that they want to deal with. We are letting them create their own presentation. So we're getting pretty close to project-based learning here. But let's take a look at this rewritten assignment. How does America differ from other countries in their view and acknowledgement of death in society? In your groups, design a presentation which details these differences. Well, let's take a look here. The first thing is we are going to have this key word here, which is differ. We have a question that has been proposed to our students. How does America differ from other countries? So they're still going to have to look at other countries. So they get to pick the countries. They're still going to have to look at this idea and concept of death. So that means they're going to have to research, of course, what some of their customs are, what some of their traditions are dealing with death. But then they're going to have to detail the differences, which means that in their research, they're going to have to isolate the similarities so that they can focus on those differences. So again, we have taken a somewhat complex assignment and we have now turned it into a project-based learning assignment that offers student choice and voice, that offers a guide on their research, because of course they're going to be the ones to pick the countries and they're going to have to pick the research that they look at. And then they're going to have to talk about the differences between America and these other countries, which means they're going to have to analyze these traditions and customs. They're going to have to look at them very, very closely as opposed to just listing them. And then finally, our last assignment here, describe how modern technology has impacted society in a negative way. Well, when we look at our project-based learning assignment, with the benefits of technology also come the negatives. In your groups, identify at least 3 technology-influenced problems that have a profound effect on society and possible solutions for each. So again, what we have here is we have a listed description of modern technology and the negatives that it has placed on society. The problem is that, of course, once we get into the wording, one of the problems we have is that we know that when we say modern technology, the first things that a lot of students are going to do, they're going to look at cell phones, they're going to look at computers, maybe they'll look at stolen identities and things like that. Whereas here, when we say technology influenced problems, we really allow our students, especially our creatively minded students, to really kind of look at the world and really think about problems in the world and are they technology influenced? If we look at divorce, are they going to look at divorce from a technology influence perspective? Because you have things like Facebook, of course, online dating, and so forth. So this really kind of broadens the problems that they can come up with. And of course, if they're coming up with these problems and saying they're technology influenced, they're going to have to identify how are they technology influenced. So they're going to have to identify the problem. They're going to have to identify the effect. So right off the bat, again, what's the effect? And then what is a possible solution? So here we're having multiple components of an assignment that again leads to this idea of project-based learning. So let's take a look at some of these other components. So we have student choice and voice, which we've looked at the previous assignments. And This is what makes project learning so effective. This idea of student choice and voice, because what it does is it gives students control over their own learning. They feel much more involved because they get to have a lot of decision making in their process. So the learning becomes much more personal because they have this control. And of course, because it becomes so personal, it does lead to greater involvement. A real world focus. Project based learning, even in things that are fiction based, will have some kind of real world focus. And I'm sure that as educators, we've all heard this question: when will I ever need this? Or when will I ever use this? And what we want to do is we want to emphasize to the students that even if we're looking at something fictional, that it's not about the actual fiction. It's about the concepts, the ideas, the thinking that goes into the project that they are doing. So, for example, no, they may never need to know the characters and the plot for 1984 ever in their life once they leave our classroom. However, knowing the idea and concept of politics, this idea of imposed restriction for breaking the rules, the idea of Big Brother watching you, the idea of people just following along for following along's sake. All of these ideas are things that are still real world based. When we look at the elections, when we look at privacy laws, when we look at new laws that are imposed for certain crimes, we can, of course, have the student really reflect on this based off of what they may have learned from 1984. Ongoing evaluations, even though the students are directing their learning, even though we want them to, of course, take control of their learning, we as the teachers are still the guide, and we need to make sure that they are not getting off track. And so we need to do, of course, periodic evaluations to make sure that the students are understanding what it is that they need to be looking at. Because sometimes students tend to go too big, sometimes they get too small, sometimes they just get off track, period, because they may get distracted by something else. And so as we're teaching concepts, as we're teaching lessons, as we're teaching a process, we may have quizzes to make sure that they are focused on what they need to be focused on. Or we may have writings that we assign, or we may have tiny mini projects that they have to complete in order to make sure that they are on the right path. Ongoing reflection. Now, this is a non-negotiable. This is something that is absolutely, positively required for project-based learning. And the reason why this is a non-negotiable is because we want to make sure that the students are really thinking about their learning, that they're not just slapping something down on a piece of paper or on a PowerPoint, that they're not just, putting something down, turning it in, and that's it. We want them to reflect. And so how does what they have learned affect either them or maybe their career or their families or their society? How does it affect these things? And the reflection won't always be positive. And that's okay, because the thing is even a negative reflection means that they are having a reaction. And that reaction comes from thinking. So even if it's not a positive reaction, that's okay. We can accept a negative reflection as long as they have a reason for it, as long as they can justify their negative reflection, which shows that they are thinking. So some of the key researchers for project-based learning are listed here. And so the first is, of course, Benjamin Bloom, that many of us have heard of in our education classes. Benjamin Bloom is the creator of Bloom's taxonomy, and he basically had an ascension of skills, with creation being the ultimate expression of mastery. Now, Bloom's taxonomy does deal with evaluation, it has understanding, it has application and analyzing, all of these really great skills. But Bloom believed that creation was the penultimate expression of learning, that all of these other things are great, but once we can actually create with what we've learned, then we have become masters. Then we have Jerome Bruner, who is the father of constructivist theory. Now, I always like to think about Bruner being the father of constructivist theory because I always think of Bruner's Bridge. Don't ask me why, but that's the first thing I think of is I think of Bruner's Bridge, like the Brooklyn Bridge, Bruner's Bridge. And so when I think of a bridge, I think of this idea of constructing a bridge. And so Jerome Bruner basically said that by making learners active in the acquisition of knowledge, that they are constructing their own knowledge, which is at the heart of project-based learning, this idea that we, of course, have active learners, and so they are constructing their own knowledge as they go. We have John Dewey, who, again, he posited that the idea that children and adults learn best by doing, that it's not a passive act. If we just tell people something, they are not going to remember it forever. And we, of course, as educators, know that just telling people things doesn't mean they've automatically acquired the knowledge. They might be able to repeat it to us, but that doesn't mean that they actually know it. Jean Piaget is the father of theory of cognitive development, which basically said that children learn in stages, and so that there are stages of learning. And then you have Lev Vygotsky, who believed and advocated this idea of communal learning, that we learn best in groups. And this, of course, has become a really huge concept in modern education, that education is not just an isolated thing. That yes, we do need to do things independently. This, of course, is not debatable, but that at the same time, we learn from others, that other people and other people's ideas and other people's skills only help to make us stronger and our knowledge base stronger. And so Lev Vygotsky was a huge proponent of this. And then finally, we get to technology and project-based learning. Now, technology is not a requirement for project-based learning. I want to emphasize this because a lot of schools, especially a lot of public schools in inner cities and so forth, they don't have as much technology as maybe some of the other schools that are out there. And so this should not limit the idea of using project-based learning in a classroom. Now, technology does enhance the process, and I won't lie, it does allow for more research options such as databases. It does allow for more creativity and innovation because there are increased products that people can use. There are, of course, a variety of technology tools that students get to use. Time efficiency, you're not having to cut and paste or handwrite. And then, of course, it does allow for greater group communication. Students, of course, can use Skype or Hangouts and other technological tools. But at the same time, as wonderful as all of these things are, again, it is not a requirement for project-based learning. Students can still use books. Students can still use poster boards. Students can still use construction paper and create a final product, in a group that is complex and does answer a question. So I just want to make sure that I do point that out. So thank you for listening to my explanation about project-based learning, and I hope it has helped you to have a better understanding of what project-based learning is.